what is conscription? Conscription can be defined as mandatory enlistment for state services, typically the armed forces. This is also commonly referred to as a military draft. Conscription has existed throughout history all over the world in a variety of conflicts. Although strategies have changed since, conscription is recognized as being used in the U.S. military ever since the Civil War. In the Civil War, the Union offered cash rewards for conscription through what was called the bounty system. Wealthy men would hire others to perform their obligation, which resulted in the majority of soldiers being part of the less wealthy population. Early resistance to the conscription process was the draft riot of 1863. The draft was eventually suspended at the end of the war in 1865. Conscription was also used in World War I. The Selective Service Act was signed by Woodrow Wilson on May 18, 1917. This created the Selective Service System and inducted 2.8 million men into the armed forces. This act also abolished the bounty system that was previously used in the Civil War. This specific draft targeted able-bodied men aged 18 to 45. The use of conscription continued into World War II when, in a close vote, Congress passed the Selective Service Training and Service Act, signed by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt on September 16, 1940. 45 million men registered and more than 10 million were inducted through selective service between November 1940 and October 1946. This act expired in March 1947, but President Truman pushed for an extension. The Selective Training and Service Act was put back in place in June 1948. What came to be known as the draft holiday occurred during this time due to a flood of volunteers. This means that they did not need to recruit, and the draft was unofficially suspended for an amount of time. Conscription was again used in the Korean War. The draft was expanded due to the involvement of the U.S. in this conflict. In 1951, the Universal Military Training and Service Act was put into place, which required all males aged 18 to 26 to register for the draft. More than 1.5 million were inducted during the war, and an additional 1.5 million were added between 1954 and 1961. During the Vietnam War, the Selective Service System faced disapproval by many Americans. Many people believed that the system specifically targeted those in lower social ratings. The Military Service Act of 1967 helped to make the draft more equal, but it did not help to sway the opinions of the opposers. Those who disagreed with the cause of the war did many things to express their disapproval. Some would take their protests to the streets, some of which turned violent. Others would destroy their selective service registration certificates, also known as draft cards. A Supreme Court case, United States v. O'Brien, in 1968, ruled that the burning of draft cards was an acceptable form of protest in a narrow decision. Furthermore, President Nixon signed an amendment to the Selective Service System that restarted selection by lottery, which hadn't happened since World War I. Between the years of 1965 and 1973, over 1.7 million men were inducted into the military through the system. An estimated 500,000 men dodged the draft through methods such as fleeing the country and mundane, which is refusing to respond to conscription notices. 200,000 men were charged with draft evasion, and 8,000 of these men were convicted. In January 1973, the Department of Defense suspended the draft, and the Selective Service Act expired that June. In January 1977, President Jimmy Carter issued a pardon for those who evaded the Vietnam draft. Hi, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, this is Tom Alves. I was in the draft. As far as I was concerned, I thought the draft was done quite fair. There was enough information about the draft. If you enlisted prior to the draft, you could do that. But once the numbers were drawn, the first set of numbers, 1 through 29, once those were picked, you were drafted either into the Army or to the Marines at that given time. But at that time, once the draft was picked, you could not enlist. I wound up with number 31, so I could enlist and not wait for my number to be called. So I went down and I enlisted into the Navy. For me, it was going on while I was in high school. I really never focused much on it. I guess my opinion on it was that if our government felt that we should be there, then we should be there in whatever support we could do at that time. Yes, I did. My dad and I had spent some time going over it to see what it was. I thought at my time, which would have been in 1970, like I said, I thought it was done really fair because they put all of the birth dates into the, I guess, into the bucket, and then they had it on TV. Every channel covered it, and they drew the dates out. And they had put them on the board and said, 1 through 29, report to your draft board immediately. And I believe it was 30 to 49, you have 2 weeks to report to your draft board. And yes, I thought it was done quite fair, and I thought the amount of information that was out there was quite good. We sat in front of the TV the night that they were going to do the drawing for the birth dates, and I wound up drawing number 31, and my dad and I kind of looked at each other at the same time, and Dad said, well, you kind of got to make a decision. Are you going to get drafted and go into the Marines or to the Army? Or, he says, do you want to go down and enlist? Because I had that opportunity because I was past 29, so I said yes. I said I think I want to go down, enlist. My dad was in the Navy, so I thought, no, I think I'll go do the Navy. If you got drafted, you were in for 2 years. If you enlisted, you were in for 4 years. So, I mean, that's kind of a toss-up. What do you want to do? I had no doubts. I went down 2 days after the draft was over with and enlisted into the Navy.
The Vietnam War was a bloody conflict that was fought from 1954 to 1975. The United States' motive was to try to prevent the spread of communism. Some Americans did not like the tactics being used. It was the first televised conflict, which created a large anti-war movement. Upon their return, many soldiers were treated poorly by fellow Americans as well as the government. Some were spat on and called baby killers. Many did not get enough compensation from the government to support a well-lived life. Eventually, people began to pay more respect to these veterans. This is greatly due to the Vietnam Memorial made in Washington, D.C. to honor those who fought. Another big factor was movies starting to come out that showed what the war was truly like.
I guess I was looking at it as more of as a positive thing. I think some of the things that we were doing were good. Obviously, some of the things maybe not so good. But after getting out, no, I still had a positive attitude towards it. I don't think America had really the wrong view. What I've seen and talked to other military that have served in Vietnam and have come back from Vietnam, our media took one side of the Vietnam War, and that's what the American public knew. The media never came back and was pushing all of the positive things that were happening over in Vietnam. The American public really never knew that. As far as I was concerned, I had many opportunities that got presented to me. I started out being into the Navy. I was going to be a nuclear submarine operator. When I finished boot camp and I was getting reprocessed, the gentleman that was reprocessing me looked down and saw that I had been running heavy equipment, construction equipment. And as soon as he saw that, he goes, well, why are you here going in as a nuclear submarine operator? And I said, well, that's where I had to go when I enlisted. And he looked at me and immediately he changed that. He sent me to the Seabees, which is part of the Navy. It's a construction sort of outfit. And I went in as a heavy equipment operator. That's what I got changed to. I was there. I went through my training. I had spent 3 tours overseas as a Seabee, and all of a sudden I had another opportunity that got presented as being a underwater construction operator. And when I saw that come about, I went, "Oh my God, I got it. That's it. I got to do this." And that's what I wound up doing my remaining time in the service. Oh, most definitely. Being drafted at the time that the draft was going on, you were either going into the Marines or you were going into the Army, and right upon boot camp, you were going straight over to Vietnam. That's where you were going. And the opportunities that were presented to me would have been very limited. You don't have the option of not getting along with everybody in the unit that you're in, no matter what unit that is. You're trained to trust them, believe in them, and it's such a positive thing that the service does teach you. And I just think that in today's world, I said we're starting to get into more of this I world, and not able to communicate and talk to people and be able to trust people. And I think that's a real positive thing that the military does teach you.
Overall, the conscription process is very complicated and has evolved in many ways, but without it, the United States Army would not have the legacy that it does today. It is important to know different viewpoints of the process in order to understand what has happened in the past and what is continuing to change today.